Hello, Catherine. Thanks very much for joining us today. I'd just like to introduce Professor Catherine O'Rourke, who is Professor of Italian Film and Culture at the University of Bristol. And Catherine has worked extensively on Italian cinema, particularly her book on stars and masculinities in contemporary Italian cinema. She's worked more recently on Italian cinema audiences of the 1950s. And now, and the reason that I've invited her to talk to you today, she's working on a book on the role of the non-professional performer in post-war Italian cinema, focusing particularly on neorealism, but then thinking about how the use of the non-professional performer develops over time and indeed has an influence on global cinema. So thanks very much for sharing some of this work with me in advance of publication, Catherine. And it's really great of you to share some of your thoughts with our students. I think it's going to be really helpful for us looking at the child in world cinema, because we're going to begin with the example of the film Bicycle Thieves, which is, of course, one of the most famous examples of the way neorealism has influenced how children appear in cinema globally. So in the chapter that you gave me to read, you talk about how sometimes symptomatic readings of the child obscure our vision of the child as performer. And you also write that it's important to consider not merely what the child represents, but how the child is presented or is presenting themselves as a performer. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about how that tendency has worked in relation to neorealist cinema in particular. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for reading my work and asking me to talk about it. So just to start, I mean, one of the, as you know, as we've talked about this, but one of the reasons I sort of became, well, I became very interested in working on the non-professional. But one of the things that was so striking to me was the fact that, as you know, there's been this massive amount of scholarship on neorealism, right? Books continue to come out in English, Italian, all aspects of post-war Italian cinema. And actually nobody has really written about this topic at all. And so that was really striking to me, because we're always told, you know, and every film course kind of covers this, right? The non-professional is one of the key distinguishing features of neorealism. But yet nobody has really been interested in who they are and what they do on screen. And there's been a kind of erasure of performance itself, you know, as a concept within neorealism, not a total erasure. I mean, there have been writings on it. And so when it comes to the child, I think it's been really striking, because the child is such a kind of symbolic element anyway within the mise en scène, right? And we can think particularly in neorealism. Obviously, Rome Open City is one of the canonical examples and has such a kind of strong presence of the child. And think of the ending of Rome Open City, right? So much studied. The child almost always symbolizing, you know, some kind of innocence or innocence lost or futurity, right? And yet, as I've been kind of trying to argue, that this kind of attention to the child as a kind of symptom really kind of obscures, what they're doing in the film, and also who they are, which is something that I'm really very interested in. So not just the child or the non-professional in general as a kind of figure within the mise en scène, but as a kind of, as a historical figure, as a kind of historical actor, if you like, and finding out, you know, who they are, how they got into these films, how they tried to create these performances. And these questions obviously become particularly striking for children, you know, for child performers, where there's kind of assumption that often they're not really doing acting work. And that's something of, you know, that needs to be interrogated. But we have very little on these films about the performances, about what happened on set often, apart from many anecdotes that have been recycled over and over again So we tend not to have, and this is where, neorealism, partly because of this kind of, artisanal quality and the conditions of the post-war and all of that, differs so strikingly from, say, Hollywood production, where we would have much more detailed documentation, right, of what happens during the production process. So there are lots of difficulties there, which I can sort of see why, in many ways, people have shied away from trying to reconstruct these things, because it can be quite hard. And also, just in general, until quite recently, I would say, maybe the last kind of 10 years, certainly within film studies, 5-10 years, performance and acting kind of haven't really been studied very much. Star studies has been a big field in itself, but within that, it's certainly in the last 5 years, there's kind of a huge flourishing of work on scholarship on acting, which is often, and I find this myself in kind of trying to write about these films, is often much harder to do, right? Because you're trying to reconstruct and analyze how certain effects are generated by performers, which sometimes it's a kind of ineffable effect, and how do we isolate that? Harder still when we don't have documentation or interviews from, practitioners kind of saying, yeah, this is what we did. But I think trying to kind of bear in mind always that these people, whether children, whether they are considered to be professionals or not, and that in itself is a kind of big question that we could sort of come back to, are always involved in generating meaning through their voice and body.
Thanks, Catherine. That's so interesting. I mean, there are so many questions arising from that, but I wonder, sort of thinking about Bicycle Thieves, which obviously has this very important child protagonist. Are there any examples from that you could talk about in terms of the ways in which we might read Enzo Staiola's performance?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously I've tried to do this. I've got a chapter on Bicycle Thieves. I've got a chapter on the father in Bicycle Thieves, and a chapter on children, and I've sort of tried to look at what Enzo Staiola is doing in that film. And he is obviously the kind of iconic face of neorealism internationally, as well as, kind of in Italy. And yet trying to pin down how he's doing what he's doing, how we are receiving that, has been, I think, really hard. One thing I think we have to bear in mind, which creates, I think, another layer of difficulty, is the fact that, as with many films of the period, this was dubbed, right? And was not dubbed by the actors. So the voice we're hearing is not Bruno, it's not Enzo. So that in itself kind of adds a layer of thinking about, okay, well, if we normally associate, good acting with delivering speeches, the ability to convey meaning through the voice, right? And that's sort of taken away in a sense, right? Then, okay, we're left with, the face, the body, movement, how he occupies space. I mean, Robert Gordon has written very nicely in his BFI book on Bicycle Thieves about this, what he calls the pas de deux between the father and son, the kind of matching of the bodily movements. And it's certainly true that De Sica liked to cast based on things like walking and sort of physiognomic kind of appropriateness for the role, and certainly wasn't interested particularly in any kind of sense of whether someone could deliver a speech.
An interesting approach you took and you were pointing out that we're quite fortunate in that respect, because Enzo Staiola went on to make some other films, and you were looking at how he performs in those later films that in a sense tells us something about how he's performing in Bicycle Thieves.
Yeah, and I think that's what I tried to do then, was to kind of think, okay, well, and he's one of the few neorealist performers, and certainly one of the few neorealist child performers. There were a few others who went on to develop some sort of limited career, and he made, you know, a few other films, and then retired in the 1950s. But at least we can sort of analyze some of the films. Can't be found, unfortunately, but for example, a film that I looked at, Cuori Senza Frontiere from 1950, which is sort of post-war film set on the border with Yugoslavia. And he has quite a big role in that. So it was interesting to kind of make that comparison. One of the things that's really striking about the later film is that he speaks a lot in it, or his character does. Again, he's dubbed, and it's a very different kind of dubbing. It's not dubbed as a Roman, but, you know, different kind of regional accent. So that's kind of weird, because then it made me think, oh, actually, he doesn't speak very much in Bicycle Thieves, right? I mean, he has lines, obviously, but what we remember about Bruno in Bicycle Thieves is the face, right? That's the kind of the quality of the face, and obviously a lot has been written about his face as a kind of witnessing, you know, the kind of brutality of the world or the failures of his father, and the face is a kind of register, and we get a lot of close-ups of Bruno sort of beginning to realize, you know, his father's failings, etc. So yeah, the contrast was quite striking. And the other thing that it made me kind of realize was just the fact as well that his face had changed even in 2 years. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why child performers often don't become successful adult stars, right, is because of the, you know, the physiological changes that happen from, you know, he's 8 in Bicycle Thieves, and then he's about 10 in the later film, and just there's a kind of just different quality to his face, which, this sounds really awful, it's just not as cute, you know? It's just a bit less chubby, is kind of, you know, his face is just developed slightly, you know.
I was actually thinking about that chubbiness watching the film again this week, because I was thinking how, you know, one of the things that defines the father is this very kind of angular, strained look, and yet the child has this chubbiness in the context of a post-war period where maybe there's not enough to eat.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know that's a very kind of crass reading of it, but it suddenly struck me that was like, I mean, I know later Italian cinema celebrates women who have kind of quite curvaceous bodies, and they are supposed to represent a kind of promise of some kind. So I was thinking about this chubbiness of Bruno's almost as being reassuring, in that although he's clothed a tatty.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I guess if you think about the end of Roma Città Aperta, right, and the children walking away, and they're very skinny, right, they're wearing these big jackets, and it's, you know, these little skinny legs, and it's this kind of, you know, the end of the war, not even the end of the war, you know, at that point, but the sort of privation of that period, and the child is also kind of involved in that, right? Whereas, yeah, I think there is something about Bruno, maybe it is a kind of reassuring thing, that little chubby face, you know, that kind of things have continued, you know. This.
One thing I noticed, I mean, I'm sure somebody like there've been some very detailed readings of the mise en scène in the film, so I'm sure that's been picked up on, but there is a moment where he's escaping from the church, and he's surrounded by cherubs that sort of all piled up around the doorway of the exit, and I was thinking, oh, there is something quite cherubic about him. I'm sure it might have been deliberate on De Sica's part to comment.
I had never made that connection, I have to say.
And my imagination's running wild now.
Bruno as the cherub. I think there is something about, you know, as I say, when you take away the voice, okay, and there's the dubbing aspect, but also the lack of dialogue. And in fact, we think of one of the most emotional scenes of, you know, the emotional climax of the film, which is the ending, right? The Bruno's tears, finally, you know, the kind of sadness of witnessing his father reduced to this terrible act. God, I'm almost crying as I think about it. It's so good. And I mean, you know, I slag off neorealism a lot because so much has been done about it, but that, you know, it is so good. but yeah, he, you know, Stiola generates this, you know, affect without dialogue, right? And of course, helped by the music, right? That is that very sentimental score that kicks in there, right? But just that, you know, the no dialogue, walking alongside his father, the tear that, you know, kind of runs down his face, holding the hand, you know. So that's all in gesture and body language and expression, you know, rather than anything else. So yeah, we can sort of identify that, and then of course there's another debate about how that came to be, and as you know, these endless anecdotes about how De Sica sort of got that performance out of Stiola. We don't really know the truth of this because the accounts are so conflicting, but famous stories that De Sica humiliated him on set and sort of called him a thief, and planted these cigarette ends in his pockets. So, and then sort of unveiled it and sort of denounced him as a thief in front of everyone. And Stiola at a couple of times has said, yes, that happened. And other times he said, no, it didn't happen, you know. And there are various other, sometimes he says his glycerine was used. Other times he says someone blew smoke in his eyes to make him weep, you know. So it's kind, you know, it's obviously very hard to know, was that acting ability, you know, because it does appear that they got frustrated with him because he couldn't cry, you know, on demand, and this is obviously the big moment where we need that reaction. Or was it some kind of technical expedient, you know, which of course professional actors use as well, so it's not a failing necessarily. But it really has, you know, I've been trying to sort of excavate all these different accounts, and I can't, you know, there's no truthful account that I can find of this. And the most prevalent one is the account of humiliation. So I guess we might just go with that. But yeah, thinking about that, and that was actually quite a common practice among neorealist directors, not just with children, but with the adult non-professionals. They were using to use humiliation, sometimes violence, to get them to perform. And this is, you know, ethically, this is not something we would approve of at all today. But it was very striking to me to kind of reflect upon this idea of Stiola, you know, as an 8-year-old child who is kind of, you know, at the time it does seem he was quite poor, you know, and to be, yeah, reminded of that publicly as a way of getting this aesthetic, you know, kind of effect for us to enjoy.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because in there we read a trace of the child performer, don't we? And it does make me wonder whether, you know, there has been this, as you say, this long-standing preoccupation with that story that's almost become a myth,
yeah,
attached to the film, about whether in some ways that betrays this, maybe it's too strong a word to say, but bad conscience about the treatment of neorealist performers more generally within the cinema.
Well, it's something that hasn't really been addressed, I think, and it you know, it kind of, there are lots of quite uncomfortable stories, you know, from these films, which okay, they remind us, I guess, of I suppose, of the distance that we feel, or we would like to feel, between what we would do today and what was acceptable in the 1940s, you know. And also it doesn't seem that there were laws about child labor, but it doesn't seem that they were followed very much on film sets. I can't find any evidence of that. So it seems like basically anything went. And we also know that most parents, when they were involved, seem to have just given permission and been happy to have had money coming in.
Absolutely. But the broader context is that the children would be earning an awful lot more doing that than they would have been otherwise.
Yeah. So that, I think, has to be borne in mind, that this economic factor is really at the center of all of this, and that these children were recruited in that context. They were often working themselves, you know, at the age of 10, 11, 12, you know. Stiola doesn't appear to have, to have been in that category. But, that is the broader context in which, this is a job that is much more lucrative than what they would normally be doing, which would be selling cigarettes or shining shoes, selling newspapers, or maybe stealing stuff and selling it on the black market. So the questions of what sort of happens there. And so just bearing in mind, having read other accounts of some of the other children who were acting in some of these films, for example, Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, we have a testimony by Vito Chiarico, who plays a little boy, the son of Anna Magnani in that film. So that's a sort of very valuable document, but he talks a lot in that book, this book he co-wrote with a journalist, about how he was 10 at the time when he was cast by Rossellini, and how much, he was working on the streets, he was shining shoes, he was doing this, that, and the other. And so it's very much seen as a kind of job opportunity. That's the way that he reflects on it, certainly at the beginning. So I think when we bear that in mind, it helps us to kind of frame all of this as being, also about work, which, as acting always is. As being about kind of power dynamics, because suddenly the director or the producer has the power to pluck this person, from nothing, less than nothing, and give them an opportunity, which could, it's that sort of fairy tale mentality, which, still surrounds, kind of casting in general, right? Whether it's non-professionals or professionals, the idea that the ordinary person could become a star, or could go on to have this career. And Stiola went on for several years to do this in various films, both Italian and kind of international co-productions, and then retired, I think when he was about sort of 12 or 13, and doesn't really, not that I've come across sort of say much about why he retired, but my kind of presumption is that, those roles just stop, obviously, right? That, you can't play the child role, and that transition is just so difficult to make, especially without any training, any preparation, and any guidance. And that, I think, is the really key thing. There are a couple of examples. The key one being Franco Interlenghi from De Sica's Shoeshine, who did become a star, but he seemed to have some advantages in that he was fairly well educated, and was able to do some work in theatre, which obviously gave him then a big advantage, because he was literate, he was educated, he could speak good Italian, which some of the others really couldn't, So there's a lot of class stuff in there as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. But Stiola hasn't actually disappeared, has he? I remember you tell this wonderful anecdote about somebody actually trying to interview him during the pandemic on his balcony. Is that right?
Oh my God, there's this video on YouTube. So he pops up every so often, and he's like, over the years, he gets interviewed on TV, right? He goes, I think, was it in 2018, he was at Cannes because it was the 70th anniversary of Bicycle Thieves, right? So, he kind of goes on talk shows, and he recycles these anecdotes over and over again, which they then change over the years as well. But he's sort of both a good sport about it, and also clearly has had enough of it at the same time. So, and what that is, I kind of find that fascinating, because it's also clear that he's getting paid for some of this stuff, right? That Bicycle Thieves is still a source of income for him, over the years, which, like, fair play, absolutely, God, But yeah, he lives, I think, still in Garbatella in Rome. And there was a video of him from last June, I think, during the pandemic, and he's like 84 now, is it? Yeah. No, that can't be right. So my maths is so bad. He's 80. I think he's about 80 now. Anyway, yeah, he's a good age. And he was approached by some guy, and he's like on his balcony. It's clearly really hot, like he's in a vest and it's kind of like, sort of fanning his face. And this guy's just like, you can find this interview on YouTube, just like shouting these questions up to him about like bicycle thieves. And all he's doing, he's just like sighing, and I don't know whether it's just like it's so hot, or he's like unwell, or he's just had enough of it, but he's just like, and they kind of say things like, bicycle thieves was such a, he's just like, or they're like, why didn't you make any more films after that? And he's just like, and you're like, leave him alone.
Two things sort of coincide there, don't they? Which is one, the kind of continued preoccupation with neorealism, and then our own obsession with just knowing about what happens to child stars or performers.
I think, yeah, and I think this sort of, the obsession with wanting to hear from that person, though, of course, what I've learned from doing this research is that, well, Sayola has said all of this like a million times before, and he might give a different version. So it's like, well, why do we want him to say it again? Because we could just go back to all the other times that he's spoken about it, right? And they're all on YouTube and different places, right? So that obsession with kind of hearing from the person, there's an obsession with him as a sort of one of the last kind of living faces, I think, of neorealism, which makes sense, right? That he's, you're in the presence of somebody who made this masterpiece, and who might, I don't know, it's always this idea that they've got the kind of key, that they might be able to sort of unlock it all, but of course
get to the truth about the
tell us something about the process that's going to really explain how it worked. But also, as you say, there is also this preoccupation generally, I think, amongst the public, not just critics and scholars and things, about with child stars in general, that where are they now kind of feeling. And there's often a kind of, there's a very familiar narrative that we see of a kind of almost slightly relishing in the kind of downfall of the child star, right? You see a lot of that, right? Kind of so-and-so is working in a shop now, right? When they, and so many of them have had difficulties of many kinds, right? Psychological and other, right? So we can think of lots of examples of those, and these can be children who were actually professional, and maybe trained as well as professionals.
There's a sort of preoccupation with the physical transformation as well that you mentioned.
Yeah, and like, look how cute Macaulay Culkin was in Home Alone, and now here he is, he's 45 and he looks different. And you're like, well, yes, he's like a 45-year-old.
We all do, yeah.
We all do, time has not been kind to any of us. So there's that sort of, there's a kind of nostalgic, we want to preserve these people in time, which is obviously, it's very understandable, right? But it's, I think, can be quite dangerous for them in many ways, because professionally, it means you're not allowed to develop, right? You have to, you try and play the same kind of roles, but obviously physically you can't at a certain point, right? And yeah, I think it is damaging kind of in general, because it doesn't allow us to sort of understand the dynamics, of how these things actually work. And child stars, child performers in general are people that I'm really fascinated by, people who have, say, grown up on movie sets and learned about the industry, from a kind of very young age, who have all of this kind of expertise, but then are maybe kind of discarded. Lots of them, I mean, we focus on the sort of tragic cases, right? Lots of them go on just to be perfectly happy doing other things and having had this, this one or two great experiences. But we have a lot of, the child star becomes a cautionary tale very, very quickly, right? And of course, there are all sorts of things associated with that, right? Parents who don't care, an industry that is predatory, often kind of sexualization, that was very damaging for girls in particular, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, it's fascinating to think about how a star like Elle Fanning has negotiated that kind of process, but obviously comes from a family where there's a lot of knowledge and experience about how to negotiate that difficult environment. So
Yeah, and that obviously helps, right? Where you have people around you protecting you. Um, Even then, that can still, that can still become very traumatic for people, but, and I sort of go back and forwards over whether, kind of child stardom in itself is just a totally kind of unethical thing, that we should never do, but of course, we all still enjoy these performances, right, and these films, and we relish in these the presence of these performers who we think to be like incredibly natural, even when they are trained, or even when they are kind of professionals and sort of repeating certain types of performance. But I think, yeah, that shadow of exploitation and abuse is often there, and I would say certainly in Italy in the post-war period, it was definitely there. And I would say, I mean, I would clarify that from everything I've read, De Sica seems to have been a very good, in many, many ways, figure for these people, right? He was clearly very warm. They admired him. He created these relationships with them. He tried, I think, to look after them after the films to some extent, right? But,
yeah, he was operating in a very difficult environment.
Yeah, so I'm not sort of criticizing him particularly, but there are still aspects of his relationship with Stiola and with other children on sets or adults on sets where you're like, oh, that's really not good.
Yeah.
He would not get ethics approval for this today. But yeah, he's operating in this environment where there are no kind of rules about this, right? And where there is a kind of immediacy to the need, or the, what's felt to be the need to do this in a particular way, right? And I would also, have to remember with De Sica comes Zavattini, who has a screenwriter who really is a kind of almost the stronger kind of driving figure in all of this, in the kind of obsession with the non-professional in particular. But yeah, I think that De Sica is operating in this environment where he is probably doing the best that he can, within that framework. And I think I'm not interested really in sort of condemning or, whatever, but more kind of reflecting on some of the issues that these things raise, so like, okay, so we have a film like Bicycle Thieves, which is an acclaimed global masterpiece. It's always on the list of the top, 10, 20 films of all time. It's celebrated by figures like Martin Scorsese, and held up always as, a kind of timeless piece of cinema, which, I agree with in many ways. But like, okay, then we're like, so is anything worth the, that product, to what extent do we question, the methods that have allowed us to have received this amazing masterpiece?
Yes, and as I think you are going on to ask in your work, how can they help us to reflect on practices in the present as well?
Yeah, which are very different, right? So we know that these things mostly would not be allowed, and certainly not in industries that are highly regulated, right, where child labor is kind of protected, right? We think, though we still hear all sorts of stories that are disturbing, but I think the non-professional brings a particular set of issues about this, because they have so little protection often. They have so little knowledge about how the industry works. They have so little sense of their own, kind of value, as it were. And that, often gives me pause, when I see cases, in sort of contemporary cases where you're kind of thinking, oh, I hope this person has, good people around them you know, who will, you know, can will look out for them. And, you know, that sense of the film industry as, you know, still being a place that is, you know, that is exploitative, you know, because it takes people like that and it will just use them up and move on. And this applies to mainstream film, it applies to great auteurs who may have, you know, great intentions, but they're not the ones who are left with, you know, the consequences of I mean, one of the examples I go back to often is Slumdog Millionaire, right, which got a lot of attention for this, you know, in 2008 because the children were, you know, taken from the slums of Mumbai, and the film itself is this global blockbuster, and the children are central to the, you know, to the success of that. And, you know, you look at everything that Danny Boyle, the director, did to try and protect those children, right? You know, setting up trust funds for them to make sure that they profited off the film and also that relatives couldn't, you know, take their money, etc. But yet some of the, you know, there were still some very disturbing stories around the lives of those children, and also a kind of more generalized issue of what happens to someone like that in a very, very poor environment when they then have to just go back to that, either go back to that normal life, which having been, you know, often changed by this experience materially, or they have to sort of find a different life, you know, away from the place that they grew up, right? A more middle class existence. Maybe now they've got more money, but they're, you know, so these, you know, some of the accounts from many different films, you know, even in the contemporary period, you know, they still kind of resonate without those kind of questions, you know, because I don't think those questions go away at all.
Thank you, Catherine. I think you've given us so much food for thought for thinking through the role of the child in global cinema, not just in Bicycle Thieves, but it's something we can think about across a range of films. So I'll let you know how we get on with that, and
thank you.
Hopefully we'll come across some interesting things to feed back into your work.
Yes, well, I would love to hear if your students have any thoughts, you know, in particular on the child, you know, as a kind of performer, because as I say, I think once we start to look at that, all sorts of really interesting things come to light.
I think so. Thank you so much for sort of setting our module up in this really useful frame.
No, I've really enjoyed it. I could talk about non-professionals till the cows come home, as you know.
We might come back to you. And we'll really look forward to having your book on the module reading list, hopefully in
I ever finish it
in the future.
Yes, that would be great. But yeah, who knows?
Thank you.
Okay.